Okay, good morning. So here I am. When you prepare for something like this, you never know what to expect. Yeah. So we had dinner last night with some of the organizers, and I asked them, so, what should I tell those people? Because there's so many ways of looking at this work, There's a very practical way of like, how do you organize a meeting that create meaningful engagement between people, all the way to, what does it say about human knowledge and, is it a theory of human knowledge and so on and so forth. So, but they told me that you are very rather sophisticated people. So I thought that I would actually, rather than simply talk about cognitive practice as a kind of pedagogical technique that has been used in different organizations, that give you a bit of insight into really the learning theory that is underlying this concept of cognitive practice, because this concept of cognitive practice really does not exist by itself. It exists in the context of a certain perspective on learning. And so I'm going to take you through the history of this perspective since its inception in 1987 to today. Okay, it has evolved actually, going through what I call different phases. And so I'm going to take you through those phases. But I may bore you to death, perhaps, so don't let me. Okay? I've heard this next lecture before, so it's not like I need to hear it another time. Okay? But to interact with you, to see what it means to you, and so on and so forth, that's much more interesting to me, and I think it will be also more interesting to you. So you get 10 points for being the first person to interrupt me. Okay? Yeah. So, first of all, learning theory matters. You may not think you have a learning theory, but if you spank your kid, you have a learning theory. You see, you're applying a behaviorist learning theory by saying, this is bad behavior. By creating a bit of punishment, I will prevent that behavior to happen again. So, in fact, learning theory really has an influence on how we approach the world and approach each other. If a cognitivist view of learning will give you lots of explanations. Smoking is really bad for you because it's bad for your lungs and everything. It doesn't work often, but it's an approach, and sometimes it does work. I'm not putting those theories down, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm using bad examples, so I should not do that. Now, behaviorism is very good, especially if you have a dysfunctional person. Behaviorism is very important to just bring them back to a level of functionality. Cognitivist explanations are very important. You need to understand. That's what I'm doing now, trying to make you understand why I think this concept of cognitive practice is important. So, I'm not putting it up. Constructivism, you just you send your kids to a Montessori school. You have a constructivist view of learning. My kids should discover knowledge for themselves, build their own knowledge. So those things are important. So I'm going to try to show you what perspective on learning is represented in that concept of cognitive practice. So the whole story started in an institute that was created by the Xerox Foundation in Northern California. And it was in response to a report by the Department of Education in the US called A Nation at Risk. You don't need to read the report to know what this report was saying about the state of education in the US. And a man called John C. Brown, who was part of the Xerox company at the time, thought, schools of education are going to react to this report by saying, how can we improve classroom performance and put more knowledge into kids' head so they can pass exams? But someone ought to go back and say, what assumptions about learning are we making that gives rise to the kind of institution that we see in the world today? It was an interesting move, brought together scholars from different disciplines, and the charter was Rethink Learning. Very interesting. For me, I was a graduate student at the time I was doing my PhD. It was fantastic to be taken to a place like this where the stars in my field were actually having battles. because the whole institute was a bunch of battles. I mean, the first year, let's say, of the institute was a bunch of battles between the disciplines about who has the right to define what learning is. You know? And I was coming from artificial intelligence, cognitive science for us, learning is, you give people the right data, they form the right knowledge structures in their head, they are like a computer. And but you have anthropologists who say this is ridiculous, This has nothing to do with human learning. Human learning has to do with entering society and growing up and understanding how the society functions and so on and so forth. So you can imagine those different disciplines fighting it out. Very interesting for graduate students to see that from a perspective of identity. Also interesting to see that, and now I understand, now that I'm myself an elder, still wondering what I'm going to be when I grow up. When you're a graduate student, you think that those people in the field, those big heads in the field, know what they're doing, right? But you tickle their assumptions about the world a little bit and they explode. So it was really interesting to see how emotional these conversations became when people were questioning each other's assumptions about the world. And in some sense, the institute was was almost like a foreshadow of the theory that was going to come out of it. I'll come back to that. So I got in there. I started to work with an anthropologist. So you can imagine an anthropologist and a computer scientist working together. And we thought, let's look at apprenticeship. Because for me, I came from the computer scientist perspective, but I was always troubled, for those of you who are familiar with the world of artificial intelligence, that we did not have very good models for meaning. We had good models for behavior, but when it came to meaning, we always hoped that the world was going to give meaning to what we did. You see what I mean? Like, your computer sends you your paycheck, and for it, it's just like, and it hopes, if computers can hope, that it's meaningful to you, that the number that was written on that check is actually meaningful to you as a reward for the work that you've done during that month, right? But for the computer itself, it was tick, 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 tick. So we had trouble with the whole question of meaning in artificial intelligence. So it was a relief for me to work with a person who was very interested in meaning, how societies create systems of meaning, and how a young child grows up to understand those meanings and participate in those meanings. So this anthropologist and I started to look at different cases of apprenticeship and traditional apprenticeship around the world. Jean herself had studied apprenticeship in West Africa. And what we noticed is that, in fact, the relationship, the apprenticeship is not just a relationship between a master and an apprentice, which is often the way it's conceptualized. But in fact, there's a whole community. And if you're a young apprentice and you have a question, you don't go to the master. You go to another apprentice who's a little ahead of you. You say, how did you do this? The master is too important a figure for you to go. And so the term community of practice, which, paid for my trip to Leeds today, was born very humbly because we needed a name for this community that was around a master who was the master of a certain practice. So we called this very simply a community of practice. We had no idea what the concept was going to do. But we had a sense that developing a theory of learning that took meaning and meaningfulness as its fundamental focus was going to be important. Because if you think about it, this young apprentice starts at the boundary of the community by doing little things like to do errands, to go get some thread for someone who needs it. So they get a sense of what the community does. Oh, there are customers coming, there are suppliers, there are people who do different jobs, and so on and so forth. Then one day, they are asked to sew a button on a jacket. That's an important moment, because it's a recognition, yeah, you are entering the community. Now you're doing something productive. I mean, even to go buy some thread is actually productive for the community. You're sewing a button. That's not a dangerous activity, because if you make a mistake, it can easily be redone. But it allows you to hold the jacket in your hands and feel the final product, you know. But one day, you know, as a sign of maturity, as a sign of your membership in that community, you are asked to cut the fabric. Now, cutting the fabric is very dangerous, because if you make a mistake, it's very costly to that community. And you have to understand what the fabric is going to go through to know why this shape makes sense. So if you know how the fabric is going to be folded to become a jacket, it makes sense to cut the fabric in shapes that actually don't look like a jacket, really, if you think about it. So what was interesting as an observation, first, is, you know, how much meaning was driving the learning, which was, at the time, one of our main critique of schooling, is that in many schooling situations, learning precedes meaning. Right? Learn this long subtraction algorithm, you know, it's hard. You learn it, trust me, when you're 35, you'll thank me. But right now, withhold meaningfulness, focus on the technical aspect of the learning. You know, a lot of kids really suffer through this, you know, and some kids can do it because their parents tell them you should trust adults in general, you know. But if you come from a working class situation where adults are not trusted, it's really hard to suspend meaningfulness in that way. And so it becomes a hard context to learn it, you know. But, you know, it's also true that many organizations have removed meaning as a basis for engagement in the work. Many organizations have become very behavioristic in their attitude. You know, you're rewarded for certain things, you're punished for others. But how you make meaning of this whole thing, that's your problem. We don't want to know. You know, as a matter of fact, we'd rather you didn't try. No, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there is something to this. And it's also important to see that the meaning making is a context of a human practice that's trying to accomplish something, and where there is a sense of what it means to be competent at something. Okay? So it's in the context of a certain practice. That practice is the property of a community. It's not something that floats around in a book. It's actually, there's a live community that is engaging in that practice, negotiating what it is, and so on and so forth. And your own relationship to that practice and your own progression into being a part of that practice is a transformation of you as a person. It's a transformation of your identity. That identity is actually an important part of what learning is about from a meaning perspective, because it's the filter. I remember a little story I'm going to tell you quickly. That was interesting. At that time, I was invited at a friend's house to have dinner. And he served me a glass of wine and asked me, "What do you think?" Drink the wine. I said, "It's pretty good. I know nothing about wine, you know." And so politely I said, "It's good." He said, "Etienne, this is a very good bottle." Unknown to me, he's a wine taster. You can give him a glass of wine and tell you, "Oh, this is this vineyard, little vineyard in France in 1963 or something like this," you know. So I was kind of taken aback. He wanted to honor me with a good bottle, and so he started describing what the wine meant to him, and it's like discovering another universe, a parallel universe, you know. For him, there was strawberry, there was pepper, there was all sorts of things, a long lingering, a short entrance, and whatever. It was an amazing symphony, right? And I realized there is a boundary across this table. He is a member of a community that has developed a way of experiencing the world that is completely foreign to me. Because of the same glass of wine, we were two human beings. Some people say that people who can taste wine better have more taste buds. I don't know if it's true or not. But at least, apparently, at first outside, at least, we were just two human beings drinking the same wine. But it was a completely different experience. So practice is really important because it makes you experience the world completely differently. But then I remember thinking, oh, this is really cute. I'd like to be able to do that. You know, I'd like to be able to describe wine like this. First of all, it makes the wine better probably, and it gives you, you know, if you're at a party, it makes you the center of attention, you know. So I thought, wow, I would like to do that, and you know, and he was my friend, you know. If I said, can I come to your meetings on Thursday night, you know, because I realized, you know, because the story's not finished. Then he goes into a trance, you know, with a glass of wine like this, and said, this one has an amazing purple in the nose. Purple in the nose. You know, I was born in Switzerland. I grew up speaking French. But I still believe that I know English enough to know what purple and nose are, you know. But that the wine is purple in the nose, that was a surprise, you know. So you can understand the words, but if you're not part of the practice, it's totally meaningless, you know. I learned later, for those of you who don't drink wine, you know, that it is not the nose of the person that he's talking about. Because of course, the nose of people who drink a lot of wine is purple, but I knew that's not what he meant, you know. He meant the nose of the wine. See, a glass of wine has a nose somewhere above. I still don't know. You know? And purple has nothing to do with the color of the wine. It was red wine, but it has something to do with the berries, wild berries or something else. Anyway, to make a long story short, I thought, should I do this? So we had a little, you know, committee meeting in my head with all the different members who decide what to do, and we voted against joining the club on Thursday night. You know? Why? Because I only have a few years left on the planet. There's a lot of stuff I want to do, including moving this theory around. I thought, I'm going to stick with beer for now. You know? You see, what's interesting about that story is how important my identity was. You know, in directing me to what, do I want to become accountable to that practice? Do I have a relationship to that practice? Should I listen to these people? Should I? Because I knew that if I wanted to understand purple in the nose, I was going to have to drink a lot of wine. And with people who know how to talk about wine, you know, not by myself. Okay? So I knew that there was going to be a commitment to a practice. And I looked at my life trajectory and I said no. You see what I mean? So identity is very important, both because it is transformed by learning, you know, and it is a filter that we use to look at the world and see where do we invest ourselves and where don't we, you know. It's interesting actually in a world of knowledge management in business, the term community of practice has had a very good career, you know, but not the term identity, which is an important part of the theory. But if you think about it, share knowledge. No, it doesn't make any sense. You don't share knowledge unless it speaks to you as a person, you know? So this idea that we use who we are as a filter to make sense of the world is a very important part of how we should understand learning. Nobody wants 10 points here. No? Okay, I'll keep talking. You know, if you don't interrupt me, I have plenty to say to last until 6 o'clock. Okay? So, yeah. So these elements are really centered around a domain of knowledge in the world that people care about, whether it's tailoring, whether it's drinking wine, whether it's making people healthy, or whether it's surviving as a street gang member in a society that's hostile to you. It doesn't matter what the domain is that the practice is about, the learning process is not that different. Yeah. So, I call this the phase one of the theory. The phase one of the theory is you take the existence of a practice for granted. Tailoring. and you view learning as a trajectory inside that practice. And an important consequence of that theory is access to authentic practice. That's what will drive the learning. And of course, there was, a critique of schooling, that schooling actually separates learning from the world and deprives learners of access to authentic practice. I remember my daughter, I was helping her with some math problem, and it had nothing to do with the fact that she's a woman. But, and I was getting into it, and at some point she said, "Are you having fun?" She was like, kind of horrified at the idea that one would have fun, because she had never met, in all her years of schooling and learning all that much, she had never met someone for whom math was an identity. I don't say I have a math identity, but you see what I mean? She had never met a mature practitioner. She had never had access to the action practice, even though she had practiced, in another sense of the word practice. She had practiced math a lot. She had not had access to any authentic practice. I mean, she knew that, if you know trigonometry and you know the distance between you and the bottom of a pole, and you know the angle between you and the top of that pole, by golly, you can calculate the length of the pole. But for a 14-year-old, doesn't speak to your identity exactly. You know what I mean? It's like, so the accountability to meaning and to identity is really at the center here. And in that first phase, the pedagogical implication is access to authentic practice for the learner. Access to interaction with identities of mastery. And it's interesting because for me, I was a good student in school, but I was never asked to be good at anything. I was never asked to interact with masters of a practice, to experience a transforming effect on a person, to get to the point where you can interact with masters of a practice. So for me, learning was this abstract thing that gave me some social juice because my parents liked the fact that I had good grades, but it had nothing to do with what it means to engage in the world, with what it means to do something that's a little bit beyond where you are. It's only when I started to write books that I understood the dark night that you go through when you try to do something that's really hard, that's really challenges you. I don't know if you've written books or papers, maybe you have or haven't, but I can tell you that when you write a book, you go through a dark night. Every chapter, you go through that, it's not going to work. This is not coming together. I better go take a walk. And maybe you should go take a walk at that point. But also you should just stick with it. Because you learn that if you stick with it long enough, you can come on the other side. But that experience, few learners have that, Because maybe the kids who do sports, who have to get up at 5 a.m., to go swim, they know that your body is going to say, no, let's stay in bed today. No, I want to swim. I want to be a good swimmer. So it's interesting to think about what it takes to really give a person a real learning experience. But I think that's true of most practices. If you really want to be good, it confronts you. I'm sure that the kid who goes on the freeway to kill someone because they want to belong to their gang, they go through something. And I'm not saying so. I think it's important to say I'm not saying it's good. A community of practice is not a good thing. It's an observation about human learning. It's nothing that says that belonging to a community of practice is good for you, that your community of practice does good things, or that it is not dysfunctional. Because like most human entities, communities can become totally dysfunctional. But as a social learning theory, the elegance of the theory is that learning is socially defined. Okay, that in fact the community define who is better and who is less good. Like these wine tasters. It would be interesting actually to know how long I could fake it in a wine tasting community. If I said, oh yeah, no, great people, no, you're right, fantastic. It would be interesting to know how soon someone would catch me saying, "This puppet in the nose? You must be kidding. You've been smoking, not drinking." Right? You would hope that in a community where competence is well defined, a faker would be caught. No, it's not. No, it's more complicated than that. But yeah. So yeah, the elegance of the theory is that, in fact, every community of practice is a little hill, and the community itself defines the gradient. And so the elegance of the theory is a change in behavior learning or not? Go ask the members to judge that performance, and you will know whether there's been progress or not. So what I wanted to ask you to do at your tables, and you can move tables if you feel that you're not enough, like there's two people there, is to think, what are the implications of this first version of the theory for the work that you are doing in the NHS? Okay? Assuming that different practices exist, assuming that people have more or less access to authentic practice, competent in authentic practice, are there implications of just this for the way that the NHS organizes itself as a learning organization, if you want to use that term? I don't use that term very much myself, but so just a quick reflection on the implication of the theory as I've presented it so far for what you guys do. By the way, there's interesting research by Tim Dornan and others in medical education that uses this theory to look at what it means to have transformative experience of engagement in authentic practice in medical education. So, Tim Dornan, he used to be at Manchester, and he's now in Belfast. I mean, there are a number of people who are now looking at medical education as a transformation of the person into a doctor, acquisition of the identity of a doctor, and what kind of... Actually, it's about a sweet story that I had heard. It was a group of nurses who told me that they have a ritual. If you are a new nurse and somebody dies in your arms, they have a ritual of recognition of full belonging in the practice. So they have not a celebration. Yeah, it's a kind of celebration that they do in that ward to recognize the dimension of full mastery by the community. So I think those things are in place. But I think it's interesting to think about the ways that the forms of education that we engage in do or do not give people this kind of experience of authentic practice, and the way that this is recognized as an important part of the education process. So imagine these people. These are directors of treasuries in Southeast Asia, in different countries in Southeast Asia. They were brought together in Myanmar by the World Bank to discuss issues of management of public funds in these countries. So they are around the table, and they are discussing how to create a memorandum of understanding with the central bank. There's always a tension between the treasury and the central bank in terms of loans and management of interest rates and so on and so forth. So these people are there, They would not have talked with each other very much if they have not been brought together by the World Bank. They are all struggling here. In fact, there is no master in that meeting. They are just people who are struggling with something, and they think we can struggle with it better if we put our minds together. Okay, and some countries are more advanced than others. Malaysia, Indonesia, are a bit ahead, and so there are no masters, but there are learning relationships of people who do certain things better than others, or at least think that they do. Okay? So this is an interesting evolution of the theory, because here, instead of saying, oh, you have a community and learning is a trajectory into that community, here you have people who have a learning trajectory and they find it convenient to have a learning partnership because it helps them. Okay? So it's almost like a few grand shift. You know, instead of taking a community of practice for granted and thinking of learning as a trajectory into it, you take a learning imperative for granted, and the community is an emerging property of people coming together to help each other with a challenge that they share. And so this idea now has taken off. You know, people say, hey, you know, I love this community of practice, you know, Mr. Wenger, you know, I would like to have free by Christmas. How much is it going to cost me? The whole thing has taken off. Everybody wants communities of practice, you know. But we have to remember that communities of practice don't. First of all, communities of practice have been with us since the beginning of humankind. Okay, so this is not a new idea. It's not just a little new technique that you can grab. You know, we were a community of practice where we discussed around the fire why the bear escaped and what we should do next time to make sure we get it. You know, so this is not a new idea. You know, so there are certain conditions that have to be there. You know, and here, yeah, the condition is let's talk about real practice. You know, and they were actually developing guidelines for how to develop a good relationship with the central bank, and they were talking about their successes, their failures. These people are not competing with each other; they are just like all struggling. You know, so this idea we are all struggling. Let's struggle together is a good context for a certain kind of trust. You know, it's not trust that, you know, if I leave my wallet here, are you going to take it or not? It's trust that, can I trust that you come from a real experience? Can I trust that when you tell me something, it's anchored in your real experience of practice, warts and all, you know, and successes too, you know. That's the kind of trust that you want to establish for a good community of practice. So here, a quick definition of community of practice in this context. It's a self-governed partnership, a learning partnership among people who share some kind of challenge of practice, interact on some regular basis, and help each other improve their ability to address their challenge. So you see that there are two implications of that. They improve their practice, individually, collectively, and they define what competence means in that context. I think that's really important to see that the community defines what competent behavior means in that context. Because of course, there are a lot of invasion of the definition of competence by organizational systems. So the question is, how much people can engage in the definition of the competence that matters to their practice. So there is an element of agency here that is fundamental to the very notion of a community of practice. There is a beautiful description actually of a trust in the UK, an ethnographic description of a trust in the UK that reacts to some kind of mandate about renal failure quota or something like this. I don't understand the exact, but it was interesting how the trusts kind of negotiate with each other, how they can both serve their patient and give the right numbers to the mandate that they had received. So this notion that a community of practice, because of its local definition of competence, is a kind of mediating device between people's experience and some imperatives that are imposed on them. And by the way, I should be clear that I don't demonize the notion of mandate. You know, I've seen enough dysfunctional communities of practice not to romanticize them. Okay, so we'll come back to that to that thing. But I think it's important to view it as a dimension. And actually, to tell you the truth, talking about learning theory, for the World Bank to bring these treasury people together to have these kind of discussions is quite a transformative. Maybe you can quite appreciate how transformative it is. You know, the World Bank, the traditional way of the World Bank is the North knows, the South doesn't. We're going to lend money to the South, send our experts to tell them how to use that money, and this is how we do development. To bring countries together, and by the way, there's an expert. This guy is an expert. Talking about expert, he's a so-called expert. Yeah? But he's facilitating conversation. He's bringing what he has, but the ownership of the learning process is by the group, not by the expert. So the expert contributes and is very valued, you know, because these people only know their own country, you know. So to have an expert there is fantastic. But the conversation is a conversation about practice among people who are struggling. So yeah, there is a kind of a horizontal view of learning here that is quite transformative. And even in business, you know, traditionally in business, the way you manage knowledge is you extract it from practice, you transform it into procedures, and you serve it back, you know. So learning is a very vertical process in a traditional Tayloristic organization. You know? This idea that an organization with a traditional Tayloristic view of this would hire a person like me to go help them form networks among practitioners is anathema. You know, it's actually quite transformative. But the organization has to be ready to deal with that. You know, in sociotech design, they have a good saying that if you dance with a bear, you don't decide when to stop. So in a way, committees of practice are like that. You know, start dancing with the bear, you better do the dance. Okay. So just a few pictures of what can we just do. This person here, this is a group of people who are dealing with transparency and accountability in so she's a researcher. She has a new proposal and she's presenting it to the community. There's a person here this is in Cape Town. This is a telephone call from Washington DC, participating in this little fishbowl process of helping her. So it's what we call this a case clinic, actually, probably from medicine. So a member brings a problem, and the community says, "Okay, let's take this problem as a challenge for all of us." Okay, and it's a very good learning. It's a very good learning device because it's driven. You know, so it's driven by the intensity of that person who has a challenge. They have to have a solution, and so it's amazing. You know, this kind of exercise, you know, has restored some of my faith in humanity. Some of it, I don't know. There are so many other pieces of data, but this one, it's amazing how generous people are when a member of their community has a problem and asks for help. You know, nobody goes, you know, knowledge is power, I keep my own. You know, nobody says that. People always say, no, knowledge is power, why would you share it? No, this is not what happens in a case like this. People share their own stories, they share their own experience, they share their own, no, don't try that, we tried it, it completely failed. It's with a little bit of setup to have the right level of trust. It's not deep trust. It's enough trust that okay, practice is always hard. Let's talk about it. Okay. Again, I'm going to go through a few pictures like this to show you little pieces of design that we do. These are just examples. Role play. This is in South Sudan, and they are role playing a public hearing by a public accounts committee for South Sudan, a new country, to learn how to do that. And so the other countries are acting as naughty ministers being drilled by the legislature. Okay, so just a little role playing that took a day, but it was an amazing experience for everybody. Here, foundations that work in this is surveillance. So these people, you know, fund Ebola project and these kind of things, you know, but they don't talk to each other. So they're brought together couldn't we have a community of practice to learn how to work together? But they don't know each other. So we create a big matrix on the wall, and through a cafe process, we had them come up with the kind of thing they would like to know about each other, you know? And so in the column, you have questions that they have about each other. And here you have the name of the different organizations. And they respond, you know, with different colors. Green means, yeah, we do that. We think we do it pretty well. Blue, we would like to do that, but we don't do it very well, or we don't do it at all. And red, that's out of scope for our foundation. Right? And so in an afternoon, they had come up with a representation of the field, you know, a representation of what they did, of learning opportunities. Then we had each organization kind of comment on their column, and then we had pairs of people analyze a line to see, okay, where do we stand on that question, you know? And so it allows people to have a sense of who are good learning partners for me, what could we do together, and so on and so forth. So this is more to give a sense of the picture of where a group is at. This is a debate tradition. I don't know if you have high school debates here in the UK, but in the US it's a big thing. Yeah? You are told to debate a side of an issue no matter what you believe, you know. And this is an exercise we do with communities. You know, when there is a question, a yes or no question, we divide the group into two. They build their argument, yes or no, no matter what they believe, you know. Then they come to the middle. Like you can see that there are two teams that are there, and they're going to debate 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, pom, 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 pom. Then they go back, do a counter-argument, bring someone back for the final counter-punch. Just a little activity that allows, again, for instance, one of the reasons this activity is important is that in a community, the big danger is groupthink. You know? That you have doubts about something, but you don't quite dare express your doubts because it might disrupt the we belong together kind of feel of the community. You know? That's a very big danger. Right? Sense of belonging is a beautiful thing. You know, having a shared vocabulary to talk about problems is a beautiful thing. But when it gets too tight, you get groupthink, and the community it's like cancer. You know, cell growth is good, but when it becomes cancerous, the same cell growth. I don't know if it's the same. Don't quote me on that. You know that better. But what I'm saying is that an interesting thing about cancer is that it's a process that's positive at some level that becomes negative when it's out of control. You know, and groupthink is a bit like this. That tightness, that sense of trust of a community can lead people not to voice doubts that they have. And so here we make it your duty to express doubts. Even if you believe in nothing, find all the counter-arguments for it. It's a good exercise to keep a community on its toes. And at the end, we let people talk about what they really believe. But after having heard, having been forced to hear both sides of the argument, it's a helpful way to deal with the community. Creating a model of practice here. These are budget managers in Nigeria, in different states in Nigeria. They are really describing their practice, the practice of building a budget. They said, okay, you do this, and then you do that, and then you do that. And for each activity, they have described at what level, what it looks like at different levels. They self-evaluate. And they kind of like establish a learning landscape for the group by developing a model of their practice at different states of advancement. But it's good to have the community do that. We could have brought an expert, give it to them. They did it themselves. They went through the process of saying, okay, if you are writing a budget letter to your ministers, what is a really beginning? Maybe you don't even write a budget letter, or at some point you write better and better budget letter. Yeah. So they had a good sense of what it means to be good in that practice, in that country. So, if you ask people, so why do you bother with your community? These are the kind of answers that you get. And it goes all the way to simply getting help with something that really bothers me. I have people I can turn to. You know, if you work on a team, you know, often that team is not the right learning partner because people don't understand what you're doing. So sometimes your team is not, they're good collaborators, but they're not necessarily good learning partners if you have a knotty problem, you know. So just to help each other solve problems, get out of your little local context, improve your practice, build shared understanding. Some oncological surgeons in Ontario, one of their practice as a community is to read the research and say, okay, what are the implications for our practice? You know? For them to build a shared understanding of the practical implication of the research is something that they need each other for. All the way to finding a voice and gain a strategic influence. You hear people say, now that I have a community of practice, I can take risk, I can convince my manager better. Because it's not just my voice. I have a whole community that says, this is what we should do. So you gain a kind of strategic voice in the organization that is different than if you were talking as an individual. Find a home for their identity. You know, that's important, you know. Remember, he was at Health Canada. Someone belonged to the community on public engagement. He says, the community is the only place where I can be myself. It's a very political organization. I deal with the public all the time. I have to present a certain picture. Here, she said, I can let my hair down. You know, it's a place for me as a practitioner where I'm valued as a person, as a person who lives that. You know, so it's a home. It's a home for who you are. You know, and sometimes to transform their environment. You know, some communities really want to just not improve their practice, but change the way things are done. So that's also a good learning goal, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. So these are the kind of things you hear, you know. And so now, if we move to phase 2 and say, okay, what is the essence of learning capability in a phase 2 community? It's not so much access to authentic practice, because this we assume from phase 1. But this is notion of contestability, you know. It's this notion of, and this is where, you know, the master is in a different position. Catherine, I'm talking to you. Now, this is where this notion of contestability is very, very important here. Okay, that the master is not free of contestability. It can still be a master, but contestability is essential to the learning of the community. I don't know if this makes sense. In a way, Wikipedia is like that, right? Wikipedia has passed Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of number of errors because of the contestability issue. The article is contestable, and so when it stabilizes, it kind of represents some kind of optimal consensus, you know. But it's not, so contestability here is not a negative thing, you know. It's not like, oh, we're going to be at each other's throat. But it's the idea that when we learn together, we have to make statements that are contestable so that the community, it's like the difference between a network and a community, right? If you have in a network and you have a question, you call your friend and you ask your question. In a community, you pose the question to the community and everybody sees the question and everybody sees the answer. If there is enough trust, there can be contestability. No, this answer didn't work in our context for this reason or that reason. So overall, you have a better assurance of quality than if it is just you calling your friend to ask a question. Yeah.
Where does hierarchy fit in? I mean, I guess hierarchy is not a good thing in this context, but clearly hierarchies exist and people know more than other people.
Okay, so I would like to distinguish hierarchy in people know more than others from hierarchy people have a control over others because of position in the organization. Now, contestability does not mean equality. Okay? So the fact that you have 20 years of experience gives weight to your engagement with the community, a weight that is very different from somebody who's just starting. Contestability just means that if the person who's just starting really has doubt about what you said, they should be able to express that. Okay? So contestability means you don't silence voices, but it doesn't mean equality. I think it's really, really important here, that if competence is a social achievement, then power is inherent. And power is not a bad thing, So the fact that you are a physician with 30 years of experience under your belt is definitely going to mean something, So it's not to deny that at all, but it is to say, in the kind of community of practice that we build now, in some sense, the competence is not known, is not fully known. You see what I mean? So in phase one, we assume that the competence was established. Right? Here, we don't assume that there is an established competence. It's always in negotiation. It's always in possible reconstruction. Right? Again, not to deny the value of experience. On the contrary, to value experience is very, very central. But in our experience, communities of practice as a learning device work best for things what we have to learn is what we don't know yet. There is a tension between power and learning. Learning is power, power is learning, and yet there is a tension between the two. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Michel Foucault, this is very much kind of Michel Foucault talks about power knowledge. Here we talk about power learning, Because in some sense, learning in this perspective is a claim to competence, right? And that claim to competence may or may not be accepted by the community. Okay? So if you're an apprentice, you do something, you show it to the master, it's a claim to competence, and the master will say, I don't know, Or, great, yeah. Now, in phase two, in some sense, in phase one, competence shapes experience. And you achieve mastery when your experience reflects mastery, right? Like when people if I can say, yeah, there is good purple in the nose here, right? In phase two, there's also the idea of purple in the nose. No, I think there is electricity in the temples. You know what I mean? Oh, electricity in the temples? No, you must, again, you must be smoking, not drinking, But maybe over time, there was a time when purple in the nose did not exist in that community. Somebody brought it and people said, no, you must be dreaming, purple in the nose doesn't exist. Our understanding of learning has evolved, right? So, phase one and phase two will coexist in the community. There's still a need to bring in newcomers, There's still a need to open the practice to people who don't quite understand it, But what we're saying is that's not all that learning is about. There's a lot of learning that takes place for the masters themselves, for the full members themselves. A community is a learning entity which learns by opening contestability relationship between statements of truth. If that makes sense, yeah? No. Yeah, no, but think, this is really the Renaissance, What happened when we discovered, when we established the scientific method, It's this, Suddenly, to make a statement of truth was not to purify your heart, to transform lead into gold. It was to make a statement to a community that was going to debate it. That's what peer review is, It's understanding that the production of knowledge is a property of a community. You cannot be a scientist by yourself. That would not make any sense, So really, in some sense, the discovery of that as a method, as allowed our societies to grow in leaps and bounds, But this is something that has to happen at all levels, Yeah. So that's simply saying that. But again, it goes against all sorts of established things. It can make people question things that everybody always thought was the grand truth and everything. Yeah. Also, I think it has to be placed in a historical context. Okay? So, a community is always a historical process. So if something has worked for a long time, it's more difficult to question it, and it should be. So you want a community of practice to have, because sometimes people say, oh yeah, to be a learning community, we have to allow errors. Well, communities of practice don't work that way. It's a big difference if you make a mistake because you didn't do something that everybody knows. That's kind of the baseline of the community. Or if you make a mistake because you're trying something new. You know what I mean? So a community has to have some demand. A community over time, if it has established some regime of competence, will have some demands. Like, what it means to know purple in the nose. You see what I mean? A good community will know the difference between someone who knows and someone who doesn't. Yeah? But there's this tension. See, learning is always its own enemy. See, people say, oh, learning. Learning is dangerous. I mean, this poor bird, right, that developed this long beak to get all that juice from that flower, little climate change, boom, the bird disappears. So learning is dangerous, because learning always assumes that the past will predict the future, But when that doesn't work, learning is a very dangerous thing. Learning is its own enemy, And so that's why contestability becomes important, because it keeps that little edge of the past is not always a prediction of the future. And we as human beings live between the past and the future. A learning theory has to live between the past and the future. And how do we manage that as social beings? Now the poor bird is not a social being, it's just a species, and the species gets wiped out. It's very cruel, that kind of learning. Evolution is very cruel as a learning theory. You're wrong, you're wiped out. So this is unacceptable for human beings. We protect each other so that we can make mistakes not at the cost of our lives. Okay, so I'll try to be brief so that we can talk more. But the idea of the phase 3 of the theory is again a kind of figure ground shift, I think, in what we're looking at. This is a project at the University of Brighton on child resilience. And the University of Brighton has a strong community, what they call community university partnership program. That is, it's a university that really wants to engage with the local community. And as part of that program, they have brought together some communities of practice that bring people from the academic community with local service providers, parents, and even some of the kids themselves in communities of practice that are not natural communities of practice. Okay, so that are people who have to spend a bit of energy figuring out why should we even talk with each other. I have to write my papers. I'm measured on how many papers I publish. And you, parent, may have a lot of nice stories to tell, but in the end, I have to write my papers. And the parent says, why don't you talk with words that at least have like 3 syllables or less, So you can imagine the kind of boundary crossing that needs to be negotiated before any meaningful field of contestability can be established. Because it's one thing to have a field of contestability with people whose vocabulary you understand, and with people who feel like they live really on a different planet. So it's interesting that a lot of our work now has to do with fairly complex communities of practice. It's still about practice. It's still about understanding what we do, understanding who we are. It's still acting as learning partners, but there are a lot of boundaries inside the community that have to be negotiated And so we're starting to talk about landscapes of practice as unit of analysis as opposed to single communities. And of course, you know, community is a figure ground shift in the sense that communities have always been looked at in the context of other communities. The notion of boundary between communities has always been part of the theory. But if you look at learning capability, often single communities, even though they could be very good at their own practice, can become an obstacle to the broader learning capability of the landscape. So the idea here is that there is a missed learning opportunity across those boundaries, and you have to reconfigure the landscape in various ways to increase the learning capability of the system. So if you think of competence as a hill, right, the community of practice then becomes a hill, and you can think of a landscape as a series of different hills with valleys in between them. And from a learning perspective, what you need to achieve is not just competence in your hill, but a sense of understanding the landscape in which you operate. So you can be very, very good at your own practice, but if your understanding of how your own practice participates in the landscape is not sufficient, you can actually have a practice that becomes counterproductive. Okay. So in this phase, we're not just talking about learning as increasing your competence on a given hill, but also taking the landscape in as part of who we are, where you operate, and so on and so forth. And you can imagine that from a theorist perspective, the elegance of the theory is completely destroyed, because I was telling you, you know, if you climb a hill, the community will tell you whether you are climbing the hill. But if you take the whole landscape, it's a lot more complicated to say what counts as learning. So we are struggling with that. That's what theory building is about. You extend your scope, but then you destroy the elegance of your theory, and you have to recover from it. Just to give you a little glimpse into the kind of work that we do. And if you think of knowledge ability as something that engages you with the whole landscape, you also have to think about the way that you negotiate your accountability to different practices. So if you think of this person as a nurse or something, you know, they have a training that influences, well, or not, the way that they operate. But you know, there is research that says, oh, this test creates too many positive, and there is research that says, no, this test is very important. And there are colleagues who have certain opinions. There is probably some CEO of your trust who wants you to operate within certain budgets. And of course, your clients themselves have certain expectation about your practice and so on and so forth. So you can see that there's a lot, the landscape itself creates a lot of possible places of accountability to negotiate, and they are not always in agreement. And of course, today, a more complex landscape with different, you know, why should you read the Twitter feed of your CEO or the blog of this nurse who is doing wonderful work in Mumbai, and so on and so forth. So a lot of our learning is to understand how we locate ourselves in that landscape. And I think it's important to understand that a lot of what we do as human beings today, in the world today, is orienting ourselves in a landscape, judging different practices to know what they mean to us, you know. I often give the example of the age of the universe. Why do I believe that the age of the universe is 13.8 billion years, when personally I think it should be older? I can't understand how quickly we moved from a Big Bang to me talking to you in 13.8 billion years old. No, it's not that much. It's like 2 years per person on Earth, you know. When you think about it, it's really quick, you know. But there is a community out there who claims that they have instrumentation that allows them to say it's 13.8 billion. So I have to say, well, my intuition may be not right, you know. I also have to say, there are communities in south of the US that think it's actually 6,000 years. And why do I believe it's 13.8? Because I have some sense of how they arrive at those numbers. I'm not competent to discuss the number themselves, right? I cannot say, no, it's probably 13.4, I have no competence there. But I have some idea of how they arrive at enough an idea of how they arrive at the number that I trust that number more than I trust the 6,000 number. But you can see how a little fact like 13.8 billion years old that you can find on Wikipedia is actually, for me, an orientation to a landscape of practice that makes me see who I am, where I am accountable, and why I am not accountable. And it's really, I don't know if you talk to your kids, they also say, so why do you read the New York Times, I read Facebook, that's where I get my news, Why do you trust these institutions that are corporate for profit, And so for me, I have to say, okay, well, but in the landscape, I know that if the New York Times says something wrong, they get slammed. And if your Facebook says something wrong, nobody slams them. So I spend my time with the New York Times and not on Facebook to get my news. See what I mean? But sort of making these judgments with respect to the landscape is a very important way of how I have a sort of claim to knowledgeability, and an understanding of where my practice belongs with respect to other practices, and this influences a lot of the decisions that I make about, what matters and where to go next, And so I think that we do witness in modernity a sort of shift of the burden of identity from the community to the person. And by the way, I think this is important. We're not talking about individualism here. Okay, we're still talking about social theory of learning. See, the landscape is colonized. Yeah, it's not a flat plane. There are mountains that already exist, and orient yourself with respect to a set of mountains that have been there for a long time. Or maybe you think you need to build your own little hill. That would be one way to create learning in the landscape. But building a hill, it's difficult, and you need help, and you need to convince others to join you on your hill. Maybe that's what you're doing. You're creating a new little hill inside the NHS, and there are lots of existing hills. What is this guy doing with his shovel? And you have to convince the landscape that what you're doing is significant, and you take it upon yourself at some risk, of your own personal trajectory, and so. Social learning capability there has a lot to do with the boundaries that you cross, the form of competence that you embrace, the form of knowledgeability that matter to you to give you a sense of what is healthcare in the world today. I don't know how much but these are not necessarily conscious even processes by which we engage with the learning capability of the system in which you operate. Because in some sense, what you're doing, I think, if I understand correctly, you are pioneering a kind of learning potential that exists in your system, but you cannot just do it in your little hill. You are in relationship to it. You are in relationship with other hills that have already colonized the landscape. And so you have to make some choices. What do we do? Do we create bridges here? Do we create do we build our new hill? How high do we have to build it before some other bulldozer comes and destroy it? So this metaphor of a landscape has actually helped us talk about, the trajectory that we build individually and collectively. Also the fact that at the boundary between practices, competence is not defined. So at the boundary between practices, geniuses and flakes look very much the same, So it's delicate, If you're on a hill, if you hear this competition, these piano competitions, where people are judged, you go like, there were two very good pianists, Why is this one number 1 and this one number 4? But there is a person who has judgment you know, the competence is very clear who is good and who is not good. But if you go in the hills, you know, I don't know if some of you are wanderers and you like to be to move from practice to practice. Sometimes to know that you are competent is not so clear, you know. So there are new relationship when you look at a landscape, yeah, a new relationship of like, what is your claim to knowing anything, you know, across different boundaries where competence is defined within the community, but at that intersection between the two communities, you're not sure. You're not sure if you're just like, and I don't know if you have that experience sometimes. Maybe your patients are so happy with you that you don't have to worry about that. But also, you know, pioneering is always taking a risk. You know, that maybe you're just, you know, maybe your evolutionary purpose is taking you somewhere else, right? So anyway, I think there are some interesting things that you need to think about when you start looking at this landscape as a whole. The theory would predict that scale is hard. And yesterday I was at dinner with a bunch of you guys, and there was a sense of gloom about the NHS, you know, like this big, massive bureaucratic machine. And I understand that, you know. I completely understand that it can seem like, my goodness, but scale is hard, you know. Scale is hard because it happens along multiple dimensions, you know. It happens along vertical dimensions and horizontal dimensions. And at least for me, as I was saying, I don't romanticize either one, you know, or demonize either one. I know scale is hard, you know. We don't know how to do it as human beings, you know, because traditionally scale has been verticalizing, you know. So, you know, in the UK, you drive on the wrong side of the road, and it's okay, because you all do it, right? So you don't have more accidents than we do, even though you drive on the wrong side of the road, right? But so it's aligning, it's vertical alignment, right? Thou shalt not experiment, you know? Because it's not worth experimenting. I mean, so I have experimented, you know, without knowing it, you know, suddenly you see the guy on the same lane as you. This guy is crazy. So what I'm saying is that there's a cost to vertical alignment. Is disengagement. Is like, don't try it, you know, don't experiment. There's a learning cost to vertical alignment. You have to be sure, once you demand vertical alignment, that you're right and that local intelligence doesn't matter. And then, of course, there is horizontal alignment, you know, when people negotiate with each other how to do something, maybe something that your team does a lot in self-management, kind of this kind of horizontal alignment, you know. But scaling that is hard, you know. Scaling it hard, you know. So this mix of vertical and horizontal is a real tension, you know. And so we have seen people who tend to work at 45-degree angle in organization. They are kind of like a new breed of people who tend to connect the vertical and the horizontal. We have seen community leaders actually do that, being really engaged with the practice, but being able to talk to vertical structures in a way that makes sense. See, because they're also different currencies. When you verticalize, whether you like it or not, you like things that travel. And the good thing about a number is that it travels across levels of scale with the same interpreting framework, right? That 6 is always greater than 5, no matter which practice you're in, you know. So numbers are easy because they travel easily across the landscape. You know, stories, for instance, travel less well, but they can travel too. But experience, negotiation of meaning, all these things travel less easily, you know. So this is actually an important dimension to consider. We've seen people who take it upon themselves to reconfigure a landscape. We've worked with them. We call them systems convener, for lack of a better term right now, but they kind of see a landscape missing some learning opportunities. And sometimes they open a new space across boundaries, you know. and they foster the way that people engage with the landscape. They foster people's imagination. A lot of how we live in the world has to do with our imagination of the world, you know. Actually, a lot of my belief in the age of the universe has to do with my imagination about that practice. You know, I know a few things, and the rest is really imagination. But it's important. The imagination is often viewed as like fantasy. We're not talking about imagination as fantasy. We're talking about imagination as like an image, creating an image of the world in such a way that a certain action makes sense, a certain way of being in the world makes sense. So a lot of our identity is actually based on imagination. Switzerland is total imagination, you know. That's where I was born. You fly over Switzerland, it doesn't exist, you know. That people are ready to die for that imagination and kill for that imagination is amazing, you know. But still, it's important, you know. So imagination is no less important than engagement in the world, or that our need to align with certain goals, you know. So you align yourself with the goal of providing better care. That alignment is actually important because it gives legitimacy to what you're doing. So these dimensions of identity at the level of the landscape are really important in terms of supporting learning.
Can I
Yeah.
just say, why did you choose that? What's that image?
Oh, the image of juggling too many things at once. Okay.
She's Shiva, the goddess of dance.
Yeah.
Creator, destroyer. So that sense of creation and also letting something go.
Well, we didn't want to push. Yeah, I think you're right. You know, but
Choosing that image and not another one is always interesting.
Yeah. So maybe we should change another one. We don't necessarily want to connote that too much. You know, it was more this sense of like complexity that we liked about the image. This sense of having to have multiple hands, because there are so many things that enter into what you're doing when you deal at that level of complexity. I think the destroying and creating is also true, you know, but this is probably not the foregrounded dimension of the image.
Because the image is, you're talking about image, and that's an important image. And
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, if it conveys that, it's probably not bad, you know.
I'm just
Yeah. We had not pushed it that far. Yeah. No, for us, it was more because we've worked with a number of people like this. It's more the amazing ability to handle contradictory elements at once. You know, to think in opposites. You know. Without falling over. Yeah. There's a dance there across the landscape when you deal with so many different practices and so many different ways of looking at the world.
I'm a dancer, that's why I'm connected.
Okay,
to that.
fantastic.
So that's my own sense
Okay.
of making meaning from the landscape.
Yeah. So this sense of a dance is very true, you know. But this sense of a dance with multiple hands and multiple feet is certainly something that we want to convey. And those three elements for us have become very important guidance, because if you have too much imagination, you get lost in la la land. You know, if you have too much engagement, you become too narrow. If you have too much alignment, you tend to follow instruction and not engage your own intelligence or your own view of the world. You know, so we have found that a balance between those three things is really an important guideline for this kind of work. Yeah. And then this sense of, you know, who are we in the world? You know, if the learning capability of a system, of any system, is a social good, you know, maybe we are approaching an ethical stance. Because of course, a reproach to our theory, which is very true, is that it works very well for evil purposes. You know? So, and it's, you know, social learning is probably very good if you are gassing people and You learn how to do it with less gas, you know. So it's really progress from a learning theory standpoint. I'm serious there, you know, because when you do a theory, you know, you really have to ask yourself, how much of the ethical dimension do I build into the theory? You know? And so this is things that we are thinking about. Is there a learning good in social learning capability? And is there a sense of ethic as you stand in the landscape with your own trajectory, with the kind of legitimacy that your own trajectory has given you? Is there something like, what do I do next? What is my next step in terms of learning capability of the system in which I operate? Yeah. So these are the kind of things we're trying. So this phase 3 is work in progress. Huh? We're not there yet. I think we are much more comfortable with phase 1 and 2 in terms of the theoretical rigor, you know. But you can see, I just wanted to give you a sense of where we think this thing is going in terms of a framework for thinking. So that's it for me in terms of giving you. I think what I did mostly was to invite you into my own thinking. Take a little tour, and then take from it whatever is meaningful to you. So this afternoon, I hope that you will invite me into your thinking, so we can see if there is any meeting of the spirits there. Yeah.
I thought you were going to ask people if they had questions or things to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, just this last phase sort of hit some buttons with me, because I started life as a biochemist, biochemistry, working in a lab. I then moved into housing, so I did a master's in housing. Started working with housing organisations, but actually I joined the policy community as well, and learned how to, well, do this sort of community practice stuff and influence policy. And now I'm leading a health organisation, so I've sort of doubled back really, and working with GPs and practitioners. But I'm also holding on to the housing world as well, so I'm very much crossing boundaries. And I'm just conscious, you know, one of the things that you didn't mention, but I just wondered the extent to which brains need rewiring in all of this. Because what I'm finding is that, you know, I witnessed my own brain rewiring as I've gone on that journey in order to do that big picture stuff from being a detail person. But I'm also finding that working within the health sector again now, a lot of the thinking is a sort of more reductionist, problem-solving way of thinking, and it's not any worse or whatever, but it's just different. And bridging those boundaries is partly, you know, a language barrier, but it's actually partly a brain barrier, because brains are wired differently. And this requires, I think, sort of quite a connecty way for your brain to be, and the device to be.
So, unfortunately, our theory has little to say about the brain, because it's a social learning theory, and we assume that there is a brain inside people, and that brain is functioning okay. So I don't know about the rewiring, but certainly reconstructing who you are, reconstructing the way that you look at the world. Yes. What is amazing is that really, when you think about a landscape, these different hills are different countries, different worlds, you know. People see the world very differently on those hills. And certainly, moving from one hill to another, most of the time you don't hop. You have to go down the valley and go back up. And in that valley, where competence is not defined, there is something that happens, you know, there is something that happens. And so, in some sense, we're hoping that this phase of the learning theory would start to value the experience of those who have traveled. Because if you just look at the hills, it's not clear a priori how much better of a manager of your trust or whatever you do is you are because of your travel. And yet, I suspect that in fact, the richness of your own travel in terms of your ability to contribute to the learning of the system, it's actually a great asset, you know. So it's in part rewiring, but it's in part valuing the gift of your travel to the location where you are now. Because the problem of hills is that they're just hills. The problem of hill is that they don't travel as hills, you know. And so those who bring a perspective, we call them brokers, knowledge brokers. Those are people who are taking little bits of one world and bringing into another. That's a very precious thing to do if you think of the learning capability of the whole, right? And not just the learning capability of a single hill. So I don't know if this is helpful at all, you know. I think that when we think about the educational implication of what we're doing, right, we would say, for instance, that no kid should graduate from school without having crossed the boundary. There would be a new way of thinking about the curriculum, you know, instead of saying, you know, you have to know the date of the Battle of Hastings. You have to have crossed the boundary once in your life. One of those boundaries where you call it rewiring, we call it your identity dies and you have to reconstruct it because it doesn't function, you know. That's an important human experience in the world today. Everybody should have had at least once, because, you know, the world is not going to work by uniformity. You see, uniformity is not going to be the stuff that saves this humankind, you know. People who tell me, you know, if everybody thought like me, we would be at peace, I'm immediately suspicious, you know. But the experience of engaging with otherness in a way that are both self-destroying and self-reconstructing, if that's what you mean by rewiring, then I completely agree with you. I don't know the biological substrate, you know, that it takes to do that. But I think it's essential, you know. Yeah.
Just thinking about that question, that conversation, is there something about unlearning and habitual ways, habitual practices and habitual, you know, the systems we work in kind of reinforce the habitual kind of patterning, and often the biggest challenge is moving away from that and unlearning what we thought we knew and moving towards that newer kind of sense of unknowing.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if, in terms of rewiring, if there's some shift around unlearning it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I would hope that it's not completely unlearning it, because you don't want a boundary to be a complete abandonment. It's still your trajectory.
Yeah.
And I think the struggle to reconcile multiple forms of belonging into an identity that functions, maybe it's some unlearning, but it's more complex than simply unlearning and relearning, because you want to be accountable to your trajectory as a piece of travel through different universes. So from a psychological perspective, and this is not a psychological theory, but from a psychological theory, it may include processes of unlearning or dishabituation. That I would certainly agree. But from a social perspective, it's also a way of being a certain person that includes multiple worlds. Mm.
Yeah, well, this resonates very strongly with the whole hill perspective, because it's all about being able, growing the capability to hold broader perspectives and also opposing perspectives. So we don't have a very linear or narrow view of one discipline or one thing, but being able to still have that dance, to be grounded in who I am while holding and balancing with different perspectives. That's a nice resonance.
Yeah. For us, it's very social. You know, it's very much. It involves social travel. It involves social being in the landscape. Yeah. So it's not simply a matter of It's a matter of visiting. It's very difficult to be reflective without engaging at boundaries. So it's seeing boundaries as learning potential, okay? Not just hills, but valleys are also learning potential. Engaging at boundaries is a form of learning process. Yeah.
It's the edge of learning.
Yeah, yeah.